Good afternoon and welcome to the Marzano Focus Model session. Today's learning goals will review the model. We'll also review the teacher development and evaluation plan and our implementation plan, the intentional thinking map, identifying critical content element. That should all be review. And then we'll dive into paired peer review observations and our growth plan element for the year and a review of flexible professional learning. This shares the Marzano Focus Teacher Evaluation Model in a really great visual that shows how our four domains work together: standards-based planning, conditions for learning, standards-based instruction, and the foundation of professional responsibilities. We know that this is an instructional model. It is also used as our evaluation plan tool, but we should first think about it as an instructional model. And so all of these pieces work together. And so stripping away all the elements, looking at those domains and how they work together, it's a cycle. We have our standards-based planning. We set our conditions for learning. We have our standards-based instruction, and behind that is a foundation, again, those professional responsibilities. Our focus elements for this school year are a repeat from last school year. So if you were with us the last few years, you know that we have transitioned to the legacy model, from the legacy model to the focus model, and really brings into focus those elements and those parts of instruction that have the biggest impact on student achievement. We like to think about this as the art and the science of teaching. So the science looks at those elements which have the biggest effect size on student learning, but the art is how you put it into practice. So again, with our four domains, we have 8 elements that we are using this year, and the professional responsibilities are only looked at in the formal observations, but is certainly something everyone is doing. And so we want to look at how our planning impacts our instruction as well as those conditions for learning. You can find information about the Marzano model in 2 places. First, at our staff professional development website, which is staff.c-ischools.org, and also in iObservation, which you can find at effectiveeducators.com. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the intentional thinking map, as well as the element of identifying critical content. And the reason we're going to take a deep dive into these 2 pieces is that intentional thinking map is used in every observation. And the element of identifying critical content is the element that will be observed in every lesson. So because these are used every time that you are observed, we want to make sure we take a deep dive into these 2 pieces today. So when we think about the domain of standards-based planning, it's that idea of using your content standards, planning your units around that, with your scales, that progression of learning for each lesson and for each learning target, being able to have a coherent plan, that scope and sequence for student learning. Part of that standards-based planning is also aligning the best resources to those standards. So when we talk about curriculum, we talk about using the standards as our guide, and then those resources that support the standards. So another way to look at it is, first, it's that scope and sequence when we're prioritizing that standards. In our district, we do that every year to ensure that we are teaching students those things that are most essential. And then we group that into our units and then dig deeper to those learning goals, those learning targets, always at that aligned to the taxonomy level. So we want to support student learning through assessments, through planning, engaging lessons, and tracking our students' progress and celebrating success. This year, this is even more critical than it has been. So when we look at those prioritized standards, we are saying that We believe that for students to go on to further learning in this content area, that they need to have mastered that standard at some level. And so we want to ensure the learning. And when we have limited time with our students face to face this year, these prioritized standards are even more important than they have ever been. And so as you think about standardized standards-based planning, you're going to want to think about what are those things that I want to guarantee to ensure that our students have the opportunity to master this year. They need more support, possibly. They might need repeat and more intervention. But what we want to focus on are those prioritized standards. And so when you're with your content teams throughout this rest of the school year, to really identify those learning goals, those learning targets, which students must know and understand before moving on. Again, in a worldwide pandemic, we know that there are going to be gaps in their learning, but we're really worried more about the gaps that are between students right now than we are between what we would expect at the grade level. We know that with less time in the classroom, we can't expect to master all standards, but what we do want to pay attention to is what are the priorities, and then where are the gaps between students, giving the amount of time for instruction that has been less than. Next, Michelle is going to present the intentional thinking map, and that really distills what it means to have standards-based planning for your lessons.
Hi everyone, Michelle here. I am going to spend about the next 5 minutes talking about the intentional thinking map that we use for observations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about where you find the intentional thinking map. You go into the resource library in iObservation under Effective Educators and type in either CI Intentional Thinking Map or Intentional Thinking Map. We actually loaded one of these into the website, so then you can just grab it there and hit download. And that is what you fill out for your planning conference before you have an observation with either your principal, your coach, or your peer observer. So first of all, that's where you find it. Second, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to fill this thing out. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I just wanted to, like I said, take a couple minutes and go through each of the pieces of it. So we are looking at a lesson from somebody who actually filled this out last year for an observation, an ELA teacher, grade 8. And this lesson is on roots and affixes. And this teacher was going to be introducing new knowledge, but roots and affixes are kind of a year-long thing for 8th grade. And so we know that this is kind of part of a bigger plan. During last year, this teacher chose as her growth plan element planning standards-based lessons and units. And then this is the benchmark that she was going to be working towards. And it was 81144, and it has to do with using common grade appropriate Greek or Latin affixes and roots as clues to meanings of the words. Like I said, it's kind of a year-long thing in 8th grade, ELA, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And so she knew that this was part of a longer process. But in this lesson, the learning target was I can determine the meaning of unknown words. Okay. There's a spot in the intentional thinking map where it shows the scale and you have to put in your 2, 3, and 4. This teacher actually took the learning scales that we created a few years ago and just dropped that whole learning scale in right over the top of that other learning scale, and that works beautifully. So she marked her 2, 3, and 4 with her gold starred. And then below that, she listed the student evidence. So what she was going to do to show what the students had learned during the lesson, what she was going to be looking for, and how she was going to be getting that done. So she was going to do 3 formative assessments through Google Form over a period of time. She was going to use games as practice, but also as formative assessments. And then there were going to be assignments that had to do different kinds of assignments over time that were either digital, whole class, worksheet that she was going to grab data from. The next part is your lesson plan. And your lesson plan here is really, if you're going to be observed for half an hour, it really is, okay, these 5 minutes I'm going to be doing this, and then the next 10 minutes I'm going to be doing this, and then the kids are going to be doing this for 10 minutes, and so on. So that can just be a bulleted list. These were some things down below, some look for elements that she thought that the observer would be able to look at and collect data on. And then she said, added the adaptations for the unique student needs for gifted, special ed, EL, any adaptations or modifications that she would make in order to make the lesson more suitable. And last but not least, the resources and materials that she was going to use for the specific lesson, she used both traditional and digital resources in this and just made a list of that. So that's really the pieces of the intentional thinking map. What happens to this then is that you will use this during your planning conference when you're meeting with your observer, and you'll talk through your lesson. And this actual intentional thinking map will be added to iObservation. It'll be scanned in and added to iObservation after your observation is complete. That is it. Thank you.
Now that we are gaining a better understanding of the standards-based planning domain and how the intentional thinking map helps support that standards-based planning, we're going to move into the protocols. And you can find the teacher model protocols at that staff development site, staff.c-highschools.org. So that's where you're going to find the protocols that guide you through each element. So let's just remember, in the protocol, there's the focus statement and the desired effect. Going back to that art and science of teaching, this is the science. That idea that if the teacher engages in a specific instructional behavior, then the students will have the desired effect. So here, that science, that effect size of any given element, it's the teacher focus statement, the student desired effect, the if, then. Now, this is the science of teaching. How you implement the elements and how you bring your own personality into it, that's the art of teaching. So using the science and the research behind the elements, and then bringing your creative flair to the teaching. I'm going to take that deep dive into the element of identifying critical content. This is the element that should be seen in every lesson. I want to highlight how important that is this year. Identifying critical content for our students who may have some gaps in their understanding based on the time in the classroom. So how important this element is this year cannot be overstressed. Truly, we need to make sure that our students understand what it is they should be learning and how to separate the critical content from things that may be nice to know but aren't critical at this time. That standards-based planning and the intentional thinking map leads us to the domain of standards-based instruction. And so it's observed in every lesson. Why? Because if students don't know what they should be paying attention to, they are less likely to learn it. If we are going to close the gap between students who are on target grade level or with each learning target and the students that aren't, it is essential that all students understand what they should be learning. Do they know what they should be learning? And are they understanding your instruction in the moment? So it's not if they had mastered it. It's not knowing the critical content 2 weeks later. It's in the moment of instruction. Are students able to pay attention to the critical content, identify what they're supposed to be learning? Go back, let's think about the focus statement and the desired effect. So for identifying critical content from the standards, the focus statement is teacher uses the progression of standards-based learning targets, that's our scale, to identify accurate critical content during a lesson or part of a lesson. The desired effect is that the evidence demonstrates students know what content is important and what is not important as it relates to the learning target. And remember, it's not whether the students master the content, it's whether they're focused on it. So focused on that critical content that students can say, I know what I'm supposed to be learning today. When a teacher points that out through various instructional strategies and students are able to articulate what the important content is of that is where we are living in this element and how important that is for all of our learners, but especially for our students who might be struggling. Think about this as a process. It's a process that happens throughout a lesson. So it's not a one and done. It's not I start my day with a learning target and I don't ever do anything else. It is a process. It goes from teacher instruction to monitoring for learning, gathering evidence of that desired effect, and then adapting for students who might not understand the critical content, or adapting when we find that all students already know the critical content. It's no longer putting that learning target on the board, pointing it out to students, and then going on with a lesson. It's revisiting it, monitoring to make sure students are understanding that critical content, what they should be learning, gathering evidence, and adapting as needed. Now we're going to take a look at the scale for this element. So we're monitoring in the scale both the teacher as well as the desired effect in students. So we're really looking at evidence that students have displayed the behavior of understanding and identifying that critical content in the moment. So students are able to accurately say what they're supposed to be learning. So if we look at our scale, we're going to go from anywhere from not using to innovating, 0 to 4. And as we look at this as an instructional model and as a model for learning, we know that it doesn't matter where we start. We're just going to try to get a little bit better as we implement this strategy. So for a beginner, it might be that you're using the strategy but that parts are missing. So you might put the learning target on the board and talk about it at the beginning of class, but then just leave it alone and not go through that cycle. We go from developing to applying to innovating. What we want to look at is the 3, that target. That's where we want to be. We may be learning and still in developing, but we want to reach towards applying and eventually innovating. Let's look at that applying. The teacher uses the progression of standards-based learning targets embedded within a performance scale to identify accurate critical content during a lesson or part of a lesson. And the desired effect is displayed in the majority, looking at that 51 to 90% of the student evidence at the taxonomy level of the critical content. We want to make sure students are learning right where we want them to be, where they are in that taxonomy of learning, that level of learning, and then it's in the majority of the students. Now, in developing, the teacher might be doing everything they should be, but it's just not working for the students. So a teacher, in order to go from developing to applying, would have to adjust those instructional strategies to hit the majority of our students. And as we move to innovating, that is where the teacher continually adapts in the moment to get the desired effect in more than 90% of students, all the way from not using or beginning to innovating. And really, we're going to shoot toward that applying level where we're seeing the desired effect in the majority of our students.
Now we're going to start to think about solving them. We know what an equation is. They're equal on both sides. Now we are going to think about how we solve for a variable. Who can tell me what the variable is in an algebraic expression or equation? Lydia.
It's usually a letter or usually a letter or a signal.
Okay, good. A letter or a signal. Good. The first thing we need to do is isolate the variable. Jake?
What does isolate mean?
Excellent question. That's where we're going next. Nope, wrong thing. Sorry. Isolate. To set apart from others. Alone. When a student, unfortunately, maybe will get isolated, they get put by themselves somewhere, correct? So isolate is to set apart from others or alone. So that ice skater is alone. The kids are playing, they're doing hopscotch. Unfortunately, the ice skater is isolated now, and she's all by herself over there. Okay? Yes, Bailey?
One time I was playing this game and it said there was an isolated island.
Oh, did it make sense to you what it meant?
No, I didn't know what it meant.
Does it make sense to you now? See? Good, I'm glad.
Isolated.
See, no one in this room is isolated because we're all working in groups. Right? So no one is, I'm isolated because I'm by myself over here. Right? But you're not. Okay, now on your whiteboards, I have a job for you. Describe or show me a picture on your word on the whiteboard what the word isolate means to you. You have a minute. 40 seconds. Good. I like it, Raymundo. Good. "25 seconds. School picture of a balance scale. You might see something like that, I know probably in science class, but maybe even in an old grocery store. They used to have, I know the one-sided one where you weigh your items, but this one has to have two sides because our equation has two sides. So what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. I'm going to ask you a question now, and we're going to say it out loud, okay? I'm going to give you an example first. If I add 7 to one side, what I'm going to do to the other side is to add 7. We do to one side, you have to do to the other side. Okay, so I'm going to ask you. I multiply by 2. What do I do to the other side? Good. If I divide by 4 on one side, what do I do to the other side? You flipped it around. Okay, let's try another one. If I subtract 7 on one side, what am I going to subtract? Good. That's very important because when we solve these equations, we have to do what we do to one side, you have to do to the other side. And showing this step is going to be very, very important when we get to a two-step equation in a couple days because you need to follow all of these steps as we move on. Okay, steps to solve for a variable in an equation. Every equation we're going to deal with today has a variable in it, which we identified as a letter. So there are steps we need to follow. First thing we need to do is identify the variable. So whatever it is. And you know that I don't care the letter. Q, can't use an O because it looks like a 0. Whatever the letter is, we need to identify it. We need to identify the relationship between the variable and the number. What do I mean by that? I need to know, is it being added? Is it being subtracted? Is it being multiplied? Is it being divided? That's the relationship I'm talking about. So after we identify the relationship between the variable and the number, the next thing we're going to do is ask yourself, what is the opposite of that relationship? When I talk about the opposite of that relationship, I'm saying if it's adding, we do the opposite of subtract. So I'm going to ask you now. If I say multiply, what is the opposite of multiply?
Divide.
How about divide?
Multiply.
Subtract?
Add.
Add?
Subtract.
Good. And then we're going to perform that operation that we just decided was the opposite, that operation to both sides of the equation to get that variable isolated by itself. So if we were going to add to both sides, then we will have isolated that variable. But today we're not going to be adding. Next one. Oh, you're not going to like me. You have to write something. I want you to talk with your neighbor next to you, and I want you to come up with the steps that you need to do to solve the equation. Write it on your whiteboard. Good, Lydia.
We have some questions for reflection. I'm going to leave them here for you to look at. We want to look at the instruction, that signaling of the critical content, how you might monitor, how you might have new ways of identifying critical information for unique student needs and situations, and finally, how might you adapt? Here's the best place to learn more about the strategies you can use in the element of identifying critical content. The best place is in the protocol. So here is the protocol for that element, and we've been taking it apart and showing you pieces. But if you want to look at example evidence, an example of those instructional techniques, the best place to learn is by reviewing the protocol. Here is example teacher instructional techniques, and then we have monitoring for learning, example student evidence of the desired effect, and example of adaptations. We will go into more detail in some flexible professional learning opportunities, as well as an opportunity on our April 5th Professional Development Day for those of you who are not taking part in flexible learning. As we dive into learning about our paired peer review observations, I want you to think about the idea of a growth plan. This is a time for us to grow together, but also for you to grow as individuals. And so with your individual growth plan, everyone is going to be working on that element that we just talked about, that identifying a critical content. You can choose that other element that you want to have for the peer review. Now, if you are in an A-cycle or probationary teacher, it's important to understand this process. We're all in different places in our teaching. And as we continue to grow, we want to refine those instructional strategies. That is up to you to take a look at the elements for this year and decide which of those is the most important to you for your own personal growth. Look at the observation cycle, again, found on our staff professional development website. A paired peer review happens when a teacher or an instructor is in the cycles B and C. So it's not your summative year, and in your probationary cycle, that is always done by an administrator. But in a paired, that is still formative evaluation, and it's really for that growth. And any evidence collected during those peer reviews can be used towards your summative evaluation. And I want to take that as an opportunity to collect evidence over a 3-year period when you are on a continuing contract. In that peer review observation, there's a planning conference, the actual observation, and a post-observation reflection conference. And in our plan, it's by a trained peer observer. And all of us are trained in the model. We may have more or less than our peers, but we're definitely want to make sure that everyone has been trained in that model. And so this is part of that opportunity, and it'll be an ongoing opportunity for being trained within the model. And we want to try to keep this cycle within a 2-week window from the pre-planning conference all the way through the reflection conference. So trying to keep that within a 2-week cycle, that we want everybody in the school district trained in the model to be able to observe their peers. I can't think of a better professional learning opportunity than being able to observe a peer and have a conversation about it. We look at that observation cycle, and it's whether it's formal or peer review, that planning conference, an observation, and then a reflection conference. Next, we're going to go into the peer review observation process. Take a look at that document about the paired peer review. And this document outlines the responsibilities of the person being observed as well as the observer. You will have a partner within your building. For very limited circumstances, depending on your position, you might be across the building, but for most part, you don't need to be observing somebody in your same content area or grade level. It's a wonderful learning opportunity to get into your colleagues' classrooms and observe. Really a growth opportunity, a professional learning opportunity. You will be observed on your partner's prep time. And you will, as a pair, you can certainly do the observations on the same day or within the same week. It might be easier to have your pre-observation planning conference and reflection conference at the same time to maximize that time, or certainly could split it apart by a few weeks if that makes it easier for your pair. You will arrange a time for a planning conference as well as a reflection conference. Prior to the planning conference, if you're being observed, you'll complete that intentional thinking map. You'll share it with your observer and also let them know what your growth plan element is. At the planning conference, you'll discuss that intentional thinking map and the growth element. At your reflection conference, you'll share your student data from that element of a critical, identifying critical content. You'll discuss the growth element. And then you'll look at the evidence and collaboratively score those protocols for the two elements. Your observer will email you a PDF of the protocols and your intentional thinking map, so that, as well as with the principal and academic coach. The person observing, again, you plan those times together to meet. Before the planning conference, you're going to want to make sure that you look at the person you're observing. They would have sent you an intentional thinking map to look at that. Also, make sure you are well versed in the rubrics for identifying critical content, as well as whatever their growth plan element is. You'll have your question banks to guide your discussion, and then you'll want to print those protocols for the two elements so that you can use them during the observation. During the observation, you'll pay close attention to the evidence supporting those elements, and then you're going to score, but that's just preliminarily, the protocols on the paper copy. You're going to collaborate during the reflection conference with the person you observed to look at where the score on the scale might be. So again, learning, we want to just absolutely stress this as a learning opportunity. You'll use the question bank to guide your discussion during the reflection conference, review the protocols and the evidence, discuss that with the person you observed, and rescore based on data and any additional evidence. If you were the observer, you'll take the intentional thinking map and the scored protocols, create a PDF, email that to the principal, academic coach, or somebody designated in the building, as well as the person you observed. On this document, you also have a list of the elements for this year, again, repeat from last year. And then there are links to documents. This document is found on the staff development website, as well as will be shared with you if you are in that BRC cycle. I want to highlight a presentation that's also linked here. For the element of identifying critical content, I pulled out a slide that looks at what is that evidence that you would look for, as well as bring to the reflection conference, but there is a link. And as we progress in adding additional elements, this presentation really dives into what is the evidence that we're looking for any element within the model. Again, the teacher is monitoring for evidence during the lesson, and that evidence could include a response from each student or could be a representative sample. The observer is going to look at the techniques that the teacher uses for instruction, as well as then reviews that evidence at the reflection conference. We have a designated professional development day on April 5th. And if you go to staff.c-highschools.org and go to the Flex PD tab, that's where you need to get all of your information. You need to account for 7.5 hours, 7 hours of professional development, and then 5.5 for the record keeping. That needs to be completed by March 26th. And we just need time to be able to process and make sure that everybody who wanted to participate in the flexible part, that we can record that and then be prepared for April 5th. So kind of cut off for completing the flex hours is March 26th. And then any additional hours or all of the hours you could attend on April 5th. There will be opportunities for the Marzano framework on that date. So you're in cycles B or C. You can use up to 1 hour Flex PD or 1 hour on April 5th to help complete that peer review process. We know that it's going to take a little bit extra time during a learning year. And because of that, you can use 1 hour of Flex PD or 1 hour of April 5th in order to complete that peer review process. And so once you're done with that, you would just email me and we can get that CEU form out to you so that you are able to have the 1 hour of either Flex PD or agree with your learning partner that you can meet on April 5th for an hour to complete the process. After this session, the next step is to revisit or to start your growth plan. You started a growth plan already this year. That would be looking at the element that you want for your own professional growth, as well as possibly any student data that you might be looking at. We know it's a little bit more difficult to track that data this year because of the absence of so much data from last spring. Depending on your grade level building, you might be focusing just on an element or you might be tracking student data. Of course, we always recommend tracking student data. It's just a little bit more difficult when we did not have very much from the spring, especially with our MCAs that many of you might be using, as well as some of the formative benchmark assessments. The next step and the end of our day is for you to revisit or start your growth plan, identifying that element and the possible data you might be collecting. And then finally for the day is to complete that CEU form. Within the CEU form, there will be some questions for reflection, an opportunity to ask questions about what other learning you might need around the Marzano model. And that form is hooked on the major agenda for day. So the big district one, which is found on the staff development website. Rest of the day, either start or review your growth plan and then complete that CEU form and your reflection for the day. Thank you again for your continued and absolute unwavering dedication to our students and to your own professional growth. Have a great rest of the afternoon.